Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to our US viewers, and good evening to anyone watching us down under today. Wherever you are in the world, we're so delighted that you've taken the time to join us for our LinkedIn Live chat today. For those who don't already know me, my name is Marie Ennis. I'm a communications consultant. I specialize in digital engagement. And to this work, I bring my own personal experience of being a patient advocate following a diagnosis of breast cancer. For those who are perhaps not familiar with Merikoi, if this is your first time tuning in, Merikoi are your host for this event. Merikoi is a global team of dedicated, talented people with a clear mission to co-create healthcare solutions that help people better navigate life with the disease. And I like to say that what makes Merikoi unique in this field is the high value that it gives to patient experts. And Merikoi's patient experts combine disease-specific lived experience with a specialist professional experience to create better healthcare solutions. So now, on to the topic of today's discussion. Advances in biomarker discovery are helping scientists learn more about the drivers that cause many types of cancer to grow. Neurotrophic tyrosine receptor kinase, I hope I pronounced that right, but from now on I'm going to call it by its other name, NTRK. Gene fusions are an actionable biomarker for cancer therapy found infrequently in common tumor types, but found frequently in certain rare tumors. So to help us to understand more about NTRK, about biomarker testing, and about future treatment options in cancer care, we're delighted to have as our guests today, Susan Spinoza. I'm going to bring up Susan now. Hi there, Susan.
Morning.
So I have Susan Spinoza with me, and Susan is joined by Sandra. Let me introduce Susan first. Susan was diagnosed with thyroid cancer in 2004. She progressed through multiple cancer treatments until it was discovered that she had NTRK positive thyroid cancer in 2018 through genomic sequencing. In 2019, she founded the NTRK support group on Facebook, which she has grown to become a global non-profit group of patients and loved ones living with NTRK gene fusion cancer. It's also supported by leading clinical experts. The goal is for every adult and child with NTRK gene fusion cancer to have the best chance of living life to the fullest. And that means better access to testing, treatment, and research. So Susan is joined by Sandra Montez. Sandra is an experienced research nurse manager who has worked in research in Australia, in the UK, and the United States. She has extensive experience across all phases of clinical trials, but has a focus on early drug development in phase 1 clinical trials, and specifically in genomically matched clinical trials. So we're really looking forward to hearing more about that from Sandra. Sandra has spent the last 8 years as a manager at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center Department for Investigational Cancer Therapeutics Phase 1 program. She is the vice president of the NTRKers Global Advocacy Group that I mentioned. And I'm just so delighted that you're both here and looking forward to our conversation. So, Susan, I'm going to come to you first. You were diagnosed, as I said in the beginning, in 2004 with thyroid cancer, but it wasn't until just a few years ago that you found out about NTRK. So, could you tell us about the journey to get to this diagnosis?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having us this morning. Yeah, I was diagnosed in 2004 with very common type of papillary thyroid cancer, and told I would be fine, on a really high cure rate. In 2008, basically 4 years from my initial diagnosis, my tumor marker went up, and we scanned and everything, and it was just to find out where the tumor marker was coming from, because it meant my thyroid cancer was back, and found out I had a tumor in my cervical spine. Gave me some more radioactive iodine, which is the traditional treatment for thyroid cancer, and then my lungs lit up. So I found out that all my spots on my lungs were actually thyroid nodules. So take it from 2008 all the way through about 2017, when I say my thyroid cancer was progressing. I had multiple neck surgeries, more radioactive iodine. I had, things just popping up in my neck, but the real focus was my lungs. There were a few nodules sitting on my bronchial branch that continued to grow. So up and through like 2017, they were getting so large that I went for another opinion to actually check out another trial. And that doctor then said, hey, let's do genomic testing before we give you any more treatments because your cancer isn't working the same or isn't acting the way it should be acting, meaning it was getting aggressive. And up until that point, too, I was asking, my doctors, I heard about BRAF because BRAF is a very common biomarker in thyroid cancer. And I asked, every time I had surgery, I'm like, hey, can you test this? Because I knew biomarker would make a difference, but I didn't know how because I didn't really understand it fully. But that never happened. So it wasn't until I went on this other opinion appointment and they finally did genomic testing and it came back that I was NTRK positive thyroid cancer.
That must have been a very scary time for you, Susan.
It was nerve-wracking. Yeah. And there wasn't a whole lot out on NTRK. It was my doctor, at that time said, hey, I have good news and bad news. The good news is you have NTRK fusion, which is rare, but there's a pill that will work very well. And so I started a clinical trial in August of 2018, and I've been on drug therapy since then, and doing well.
And so, when you were told that you had NTRK gene fusion cancer, where did you go next for looking for information? I knew you said there wasn't that much out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did a lot, and luckily we now have the internet, which is good and bad because you can find a lot of information. But even that was limited. And I searched, high and low on social media, and I was lucky enough to find about a dozen other people, all over, from it because they can be anywhere. And I messaged them on Facebook, and I said, hey, look, I need to. In order for me to go through this journey, I want to connect with other people. And they replied back like immediately, like, I'm so glad you found us. But anyway, that transformed into me starting a Facebook group for NTRK specific cancer. I belong to my thyroid groups, but once I was diagnosed with NTRK, I didn't know anybody else with thyroid cancer at the time. And it's really because, and Sandra will probably go into this, but because NTRK is found in different sites within your body, not just thyroid cancer, you really lose your specific cancer type relationships because you need to expand that and connect with people who have the same driver for cancer.
Oh, that's really interesting, Susan. I didn't hear of that before. I never thought of it in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
So you set up the Facebook group, and that's now become the global organization NTRKers. And then, Sandra, how did you get involved? How did you meet Susan? How did you become involved with NTRKers?
Yeah, so I moved to America. I'm Australian originally. Moved to America in 2014, and I got a job in phase 1 drug development at MD Anderson, which is the largest drug development trial unit in the world. And there was this trial floating around using this drug NTRK, and I think we were doing a favor by running it. Nobody knew anybody that knew anything about NTRK. I think it had been trialed, the targeting NTRK had been trialed about 20 years prior in a non-cancer indication, and those trials had not gone very well for the patients. So nobody had touched the target since. And it was a very small biotech company that was running this particular clinical trial. And like I said, our department was kind of doing them a favor. And we put the very first patient on who had come to us by chance. And that patient, after, on a standard oncology trial, you scan patients about every 6 weeks. And the very first patient we enrolled, their PET scan basically showed that their cancer was no longer active after 6 weeks of treatment, and the patient was feeling much better. And we were like, completely, shocked and flabbergasted, because it's something that you don't really see in advanced cancer patients. And then the same thing happened another 3 or 4 times with the next few patients we had been lucky enough to enroll, seeing these patients are so rare. And so, that then led to a phase 2 clinical trial having this small subset of patients, but at the time it was nearly 100% response rate. which is, absolutely phenomenal. And not only were these patients' cancers responding, but the patients were feeling so much better. They were able to go back to work. They were able to enjoy time with their families, do all the things that they weren't able to do beforehand. And so because we had such a niche market of, patients, we really became the world experts on NTRK fused cancers. And so, with some support, Susan and I met at a round table of how we can better facilitate conversations at ASCO. And Susan, remind me what year that was? 2019?
2019. Mm-hmm.
At 2019. And it's really just been one foot in front of the other, slowly from there.
I love that. One of the things I love about ASCO, it's an amazing story, Sandra. I mean, it's all of us were in the oncology space. It's our dream. It's what we pray and we hope for. It's our miracle hope. And so to hear that story is really, really powerful. And one of the things that I really like about ASCO is the way that they invite patients into the sessions. There's a whole stream where patients are part of the conversation. And Susan, was that your first time at ASCO, or had you been at ASCO before? Or
No, it was a whole new journey. And yeah, so it was a great experience. There was probably about a dozen at least of us, of patients and care partners, which is very important too in this whole journey.
And parents as well, Susan. Yeah.
Parents, because actually both asked the question of both of you. So the incidence of this cancer is what kind of incidence are we talking about? Is there a higher incidence in children?
Sandra, you can take
Yes, there is. So exactly what you were saying, Marie, that earlier, that in this is a very rare fusion in common cancers like, breast, lung, prostate, those kind of cancers. We see less than about 1% of patients have that kind of an NTRK gene fusion. But in rarer cancers, like thyroid cancers, very rare cancers like a mask tumor, or what we would call a secretory salivary gland tumor, they're what we call pathognomonic. So almost all patients that have that type of cancer will have an NTRK fusion. And then in the pediatric population, there are subsets, again, of cancers such as infantile fibrosarcomas, where nearly every single patient that has that diagnosis has an NTRK fusion. And because pediatric cancers are rare in general, they just have a higher chance of having an NTRK fusion.
I'm really struck, Sandra, when you said because we had such a niche population, we became the experts in NTRK. And we hear this quite a lot, actually, in rare cancers, or not just rare cancer, sorry, in the rare disease space.
Yes.
And Susan, maybe I'll bring you in on this as well. It's that piece around that motivation. I mean, you're of course, we're all motivated when we're diagnosed with a condition or disease, but there's something about that being so in the dark and needing that connection when you have a rare diagnosis. Susan, did you find that as well? It's like you really have to work that bit harder to find your community and to find your answers.
You do. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't have gone, I would have been a lot more mentally stressed if I didn't have the community and other fellow NTRKers that I found. And I would say if we probably polled each one of them, they would say the same.
Yeah.
If you're taking a rare drug and you're so spread out, you really are, you're so isolated. And I always say it's a lonely journey. I don't feel lonely anymore because I feel like I have, tons of friends all over the world now, and that I can relate to, that they can relate to us. And the other important thing too is, as Sandra mentioned, this appears in pediatric cancers. So a lot of these parents didn't even realize, what their child would be going through, and how they would feel on these drugs. I mean, no drug all the drugs have side effects of some sort. So now these parents can even relate to their children better and understand what they're going through, because some of these children are put on when they're 6 months old, 5 years old, 10 years old. And then they can't communicate. They don't know what normal is or what a side effect is. So in that realm, I feel like, we're helping both parents, caregivers, and the patient.
That's a really important point. Thank you, Susan. Sandra, I want to go back to the what you spoke about, the clinical trial, the first clinical trial, and you recruited with one patient. Again, that's kind of unusual, isn't it, as well? In terms of enrolling patients onto clinical trials and the next phase of the clinical trials, how did you work with someone like Susan? How did you find the patients for the trials?
Yeah, I'm pretty much through sheer tenacity. So, working, unfortunately, when most patients seek out a phase 1 clinical trial, their cancer is incurable. And so, it's a difficult area to work in. And so when you see somebody's cancer on a scan, basically all the activity disappear, you want to replicate that as many times as possible. So interestingly, at the first 4 or 5 patients, I feel like they came to us by, some kind of kismet. One was actually found at that LOXO meeting. I was standing in line for breakfast, and I was actually having a conversation with somebody else about NTRK, and there was a physician standing behind me. We're at Egg of the Universe in Chicago, and there was a physician standing behind me going, it's really weird you should mention that. I actually just ordered a Foundation Medicine report on a patient that had this, and I had never heard of it before. Do you have a drug that targets that? And that was our patient number 2.
I'm just getting chills listening to this because it's really an incredible story. And I guess, Susan, that so you were physically in a place and you were waiting for breakfast, but I guess that if we use social media in a certain way and we use the internet in a certain way, we can actually replicate those if people know where to go looking and searching for that information. So the role that you are providing is that role. It's vital. It's connecting all those dots together. So let's talk about NTRK for a minute. How do you, and Susan, it's a story I've heard so often. You kept asking to be tested, genomic testing for this, for something that you had heard, and it didn't happen. Is that still happening? I mean, are we still, unfortunately, are there patients still asking for testing, and is that still happening?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of education in the medical world and also the patient world. So I think we still see some doctors not ordering genomic testing done. But the other hurdle that we have, especially in the United States, is coverage. And the tests were, especially when I was diagnosed, very expensive. They're coming down. And the hope of this is everyone gets genomic testing when they're diagnosed with a cancer. Because it can change your life, but it's not happening. And that's our goal, is to educate.
And so if anybody is listening into this and this is new to them as well, I guess what we're saying is you have the right to ask for it. Sandra, I might bring you back in on this because you and I had a prior discussion, or the three of us had a prior discussion around this, about your right to ask for the treatment or to be tested for genomic testing. Maybe you just speak a little bit more about that as well, about if somebody's listening in, and just to underline that, it's your right to ask for it.
Yes, that's right. I think that, and this isn't always the case, but I do find that, we're all human. And even myself as a health practitioner, sometimes I make assumptions about patients. And I really have to peel that back on myself. But I do find that often, especially if you're from a country where genomic testing might not be funded or reimbursed, or somebody might make an assumption that somebody might not want to participate in a clinical trial based on their age, financial status, whatever it may be. But I always think back to the fact that everything is the patient's choice. As a practitioner, your job is to provide patients with information, and it's the patient's choice what path they take. So if you haven't been offered as a patient that choice, then I liken a cancer diagnosis as you having to be your own CEO and advocate to a certain extent. So if you're not getting the answers that you want from your physician, there is no reason why you can't seek out somebody else's opinion. You know, so often I see patients that are worried about offending their physician or whatever it may be, but really you need to advocate. Patients need to advocate for themselves, and not be afraid to do so.
So what you're describing, and what we're talking about here about genomic testing, about it's really personalized medicine, isn't it? At the core of it, not just the genomic testing as part of it, but really that we will start to treat cancer in a way that is right for the person or for the individual. And but we still have some roadblocks along that path as well. And Susan, you mentioned insurance is one of those roadblocks. What's your hope for the future of cancer treatment and personalized healthcare? And what are those roadblocks? And this is like a three-part question. What are the roadblocks along the way, and how might we start to address them? Maybe I'll just come back to you, Susan.
Mm-hmm. Again, my hope is that everyone would have genomic sequencing done on their tumors at time of diagnosis. I think there's, I saw an interesting talk too on looking at your actual DNA makeup as well, and taking those two things and having a medicine that's for you. I mean, even today, we all take the same amount of drugs. You know, and because it's a certain amount, and we have some some flexibility on those dosages. But really, if you have a 50-pound or 100-pound person versus a 350-pound, you could potentially, you know, really target that. So you're giving the right dose to the right person, and not overdosing or underdosing. So I think it's important to look at the whole body, the whole makeup. And again, really, we just need, I think there's a lot of people pushing biomarker testing, genomic testing to be done. Where the NTRKers are also part of the biomarker collaborative, which is a whole bunch of, which is different biomarker groups coming together to be a front. And one of those is the importance of testing.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And so that's the role that you're playing. And then the role that you play, Sandra, as a healthcare practitioner, professional, in that conversation around personalized medicine and personalized healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my role is changing as well. You know, I came from a department where everybody that walks in the door basically can't leave without having either a biopsy or their tumor tested. But that's obviously a unique space. And when you think about, you know, even just America, where something like 95% of patients are treated within the community and not at a tertiary center like MD Anderson, it's making sure that you're not only empowering the patient to ask, but giving the confidence to the treating team that they can go ahead and do these things, you know, that there are drugs. Because, you know, 5 years ago, one of the barriers was, okay, well, if I do this test, I don't have anything to treat this patient with anyway. So what value added am I doing? And now that there's more targeted drugs getting approved, the value added is going up. And so we've done a lot of webinars where we've opened them up to community, not only physicians, but advanced practice nurses and nurses, so that conversation can kind of happen all around every patient that is diagnosed with cancer.
Thanks, Sandra. I see one comment here. I was going to actually just stop and see if anybody listening in has any questions for Sandra or for Susan. I do see a comment, but I'm not sure which part of the conversation it relates to. Somebody says, I can't see the names actually, exactly, not only the results seen in scans, but also the quality of life. I'm not sure actually which part of the conversation that related to, so that whoever left that comment, you're very welcome to add some more context there as well. But again, just to pause for a few moments to see if anybody else has any questions or comments, just pop them into the comment box there, and we'll see what Susan and Sandra have to say about it. So I guess when we talk about quality of life as well, again, maybe that comment means something just when you heard it there, Susan. I think it could have been related maybe to something you were saying. I'm not sure if that has triggered anything in you.
No, but I'll tell a story of somebody who was told to, they went in and the doctor said, go home to get hospice care. You have like 2 weeks to live. And they were lucky enough to get genomic testing at that time, and the results came back. And a week later, that patient is still alive today. This is probably 5-6 years ago, and walked back into the doctor's office a week later without their oxygen, and walked in as well. And that patient has now seen, the graduation of the kids from high school, and I think one college. I mean, how can you? I mean, it's just amazing. That what because she had genomic profiling done on her tumor, she's alive today, and that's how important it is for everybody.
When I listen to you, Susan, and when I listen to you, Sandra, I mean, there's this word keeps just flashing in front of my eyes, which is just, you both speak of so much hope. And there's so much hope listening to both of you. And I guess what I want to ask then is, have you got a lot of hope in the future of cancer treatment, and where we're going with that? Maybe Sandra, I'll come back to you.
Sure. Before I started working in oncology, it's really quite common for nurses that are research nurses to come from the intensive care unit. So I was a trauma ICU nurse for nearly a decade before I've been in oncology for over a decade now. And what I will say is that I think in my lifetime, I will have to go back to intensive care because I won't be needed in oncology any longer. And I do believe that will happen in my lifetime.
Wow. That's amazing.
So yeah, I think I have huge hope. I think that what I often say to people is that, the 90s were for the 80s and 90s were a big focus on healthcare in heart attacks, and people, we made huge strides. People are no longer getting, their chest cracked open. They're having these percutaneous stents put in and walking out the next day. The 2000s were for stroke, and, all of that media around FACE and making sure we recognize strokes early, and TPA came out. And really, this is the decade for oncology, and we will have an answer. I'm extremely confident.
That's wonderful. That is so wonderful to hear, Sandra. Thank you. Susan and Sandra, I got some clarification there. Thank you. The comment was when Sandra explained, that you saw the results happening, and the patients, not only were you seeing a remission, but also the patients were feeling much better and doing their daily activities. So thank you for clarifying that. And Susan, when you think of the future and the future of cancer treatment and cancer care, do you feel hopeful?
I do. I try to stay as hopeful as I can. It is, being a patient and getting that scan done every so often, in the back of my mind, my journey's been so long that I have become a little bit less stressed, but I still in the back, it's always in the back of your mind. It's always on your shoulder, on your shoulder, going in for that test, going in for the blood work, going in for the scan. But my hope is, so the drug, I've been on it for 4+ years, which is, I think, wonderful. There's people that are on it longer, but I also think the medical world is advancing so much that there's more drugs. So they're looking at mutations that are coming up, or resistant mutations. So there's a pipeline. There's a well thought out pipeline. These companies are just developing these drugs. So yes, I have hope that if this ever stops working, then I have the next game plan. So
what you mentioned, Susan, you and I were both actually diagnosed originally in the same year, in 2004. And what you mentioned is the reality for any cancer patient. No matter what our outcome is, it's something that never totally leaves you. So you express that, but I'm so happy to hear you both talk about that hope for the future. I'm just going to check in again with the comments and the questions. And while I'm doing that, usually at the LinkedIn Live, I ask each person to leave us all with a takeaway thought, or something maybe perhaps you didn't get a chance to say during the broadcast, or just something you would like to leave people with. So I'm just going to check. I don't see any more comments at the moment. So Sandra, could you what's your parting thought or parting words for us?
Yeah, I think that, the relationship with an oncologist and a patient is very unique. And I think it's really important that, you have trust and work together. So make sure that, like with any other aspect of your life, you surround yourself with people that have a common goal, and don't be afraid to ask questions, and to make sure that they're fully understood. I think everybody feels like they don't want to take up time of their oncologist and whatever it may be, but that is your time, to be used how you wish. And so I think prepare for those appointments, come in with questions, don't be afraid to ask follow-ups, and really advocate for yourself. And make sure, that somebody has the same goals as you do, because, don't let assumptions be made based on your age, your race, your gender, whatever it may be, whether or not you have children. Everybody's acceptability for things like quality of life and how much treatment they want to have is their own decision. And that needs to be respected.
That's really powerful advice. And again, if we go back to personalized healthcare, that's the promise. The promise is that your values and your goals will be taken into consideration in ways that perhaps we haven't seen as much of as we would have liked in the past. Thank you, Sandra. That's really wonderful advice. Susan.
Yeah, very similar to what Sandra just said. Really advocate for yourself. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. And if you don't feel comfortable, make sure you are comfortable. And go for that second opinion, even if it's to make sure that you have that peace of mind that you're in the right hands. I did multiple second opinions even before I got diagnosed with NTRK. And for me, it was just the comfort of knowing that I was doing the right thing. If it's either the next treatment, or if it's a watch and wait period, it's so important. And just do it, and don't be afraid. Really, it's your life, it's your family, it's everything. So go for that first, second, third opinion, whatever you need to do to make you feel comfortable. And so you feel good. And that's important as cancer patients, to have our, be less stressed, and that will help. So yeah, that's my advice. Advocate for yourself and be comfortable in what your decisions are going to be.
Ladies, I wish I had met you both on the start of my own journey, but I guess that's why we do the work that we do, because we know sometimes what the failings in the system are, and we want to make it better for other people. So I just want to say thank you both. Your advice has been incredible. Thank you. You've been wonderful guests. If you want to learn more about NTRK, you can see the website details are on our LinkedIn page. Or maybe Susan, if you want to say it, or Sandra, if you want to say quickly, what the website URL is.
Sure, it's ntrackers.org. So NTRKERS.org.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And there's a lot of great information on there. So finally, I just want to say, if you are interested in enjoying our LinkedIn Lives, we run them once a month, at least once a month. This is our second this month. We've been spoiled. You can find out about them by signing up to our mailing list to keep updated. That's on our website, mericoy.com. You'll find the sign up form there, or just watch for our socials, where there'll be an announcement of our next LinkedIn Live discussion. So thank you. Thank you for those that watched and listened in. But most of all, thank you so much to Susan and Sandra for your wonderful conversation today. So goodbye, everybody.